Good day everyone. From the Bureau of Local Government Finance, Department of Finance, my name is Maria Pamela P. Quezon from the Local Fiscal Policy Service. For today's topic, we will be handling local revenue generation and LGU credit financing. On the next slide, you will see the specific objective of this lecture. And these are for the participants to be able to understand what are the available financial resources and latest practices in funding disaster rehabilitation and recovery, and increase ability to prepare and facilitate planning for disaster mitigation. The BLGF, as an authority in local finance, hereby provides the short presentation regarding LGU funding sources for disaster management and other potential sources of funds that may be utilized for disaster rebuilding and recovery. Let's start off with our lecture proper. The Local Government Code of 1991 has provided LGUs the responsibility of delivering local and basic public services and raising local or their own source of revenues for financing their expenditure assignment. So under the Local Government Code, LGUs have autonomy in deciding on the composition of local spending, taxing, as well as borrowing that they would need to meet local development objectives. The Local Government Code, which is a landmark law in 1991, also transferred to LGUs certain regulatory functions and also encouraged LGUs to explore alternative sources of revenues by exercising their corporate powers in partnership with the private sector. So in effect, the LGC promoted local autonomy by devolving expenditure responsibilities and vested greater taxing powers to LGUs. So the taxing powers of the LGUs emanates from our Constitution, specifically under Article 10, Section 5 of the 1987 Constitution, which provides that each local government unit shall have the power to create its own source of revenues and to levy taxes, fees, and charges subject to such guidelines and limitations as the Congress may provide, consistent with the basic policy of local autonomy. Such taxes, fees, and charges shall accrue exclusively to the local governments. So exact provision of this Constitution was embedded under the Local Government Code, specifically under Section 129. As you will note, such power to create own source of revenue of the LGU has already been laid down and spelled out in the Local Government Code. However, such power is not self-executory. The LGU still needs to decide what taxes, fees, and charges to impose and at what rate. And the decision on what taxes, fees, and charges to impose is vested with the concerned local sanggunian as provided in Section 132 of the LGC, which states that the power to impose a tax, fee, or charge or to generate revenue under this code shall be exercised by the sanggunian of the local government unit through an appropriate ordinance. On the next slide, you will see the LGU sources of revenue. So basically, in this particular slide, you will see that there are two sources of revenue, the internal and the external. Except for borrowings, the external sources of revenues come from the national government and from some institutions from which the LGUs have no control of. While on the other hand, if you look at the internal sources of revenues of the LGUs, these are basically the result of the provisions of Section 129 and 132 of the LGC, from which the LGUs have complete control of. That is the reason why we are encouraging LGUs to exercise the provisions of these sections, but such exercise should be consistent with the guidelines and limitations provided in the Local Government Code. If we have these taxing powers, let's look at the financial performance on the next slide. Let me give you a picture of the financial performance of the LGUs in fiscal year 2019. Local revenues reached 253.72 billion, which is 11% higher than the previous year. If you look at the external sources, this increased by 5%, which includes internal revenue allotment of the LGUs. But noticeably, other central transfers declined by 29%, from 40.1 billion in 2018 to 28.32 billion in 2019. So collectively, LGUs realized a year-on-year growth of 7% in their total operating income. If you look at the local sources, it comprised about 34% of the total current operating income of the LGUs, while external sources remain to be the main revenue source of LGUs at 66%. Let me crunch some more numbers on the next slide. As expected, cities collected the most from local sources with the amount of 172.07 revenues, followed by municipalities and provinces having about 45.22 billion and 29.21 billion collections respectively. ERA, under external source, on the other hand, remained to be, as mentioned earlier, the main source of LGU's revenue, contributing about 58% of the total revenues for the year. But if you look at the ERA dependency, this is the numbers at the lower part of the table, you will see that provinces and municipality almost mirror the ERA dependency of the consolidated fiscal position for about 70% to 73% dependency on central transfers. But this is not the case in the cities. Cities has 39% dependency on ERA. How about the roles of LGU officials in local revenue generation? Let's look at that on the next slide. It is often said that the local treasurer is responsible for collecting local revenues for LGUs. While it is true that collection is the main function of the local treasurer, it is to be emphasized that effective and efficient collection cannot be achieved without the support and cooperation of the different elected and appointed officials of the local government unit. So let me give you the major actors when it comes to resource mobilization and revenue generation. We have, of course, the local chief executive, who provides the executive direction and control in maximizing revenue collections as well as regulating the business activities within the LGU. The local sanggunian, who is the tax authority in the LGU, is required to decide which among the taxing and regulatory powers to implement through local ordinances in order to raise revenues for the LGUs. Major part is a committee, which we call the Local Finance Committee, which is composed of the local treasurer, our planning officer, and budget officer, which plays a critical role in revenue generation because they provide the necessary information and recommendation to the local chief executive as well as to the local sanggunian. Let me give you also some more actors in our list. We all know that real property tax is a major source of local sources. So one of the actors that we have will be the local assessor, which plays a very important role in revenue collection because the real property tax collection of the local treasurer is based on the assessment records made by the local assessor. The support and cooperation of the other department heads who are involved in issuing permits and licenses play a major role in revenue collection for the LGU. We also have the local accountant, which maintains and updates records of transactions on the expenditure side. And last but not the least, we have to recognize also the barangays, which plays a significant role in revenue generation as they are deputized to collect fees and enact ordinances on revenue generation, subject, of course, to the limitation of applicable laws, rules, and regulations. All of these things together, with the roles and the taxing powers of the LGUs, let's look at the next slide. What are the fiscal gap? Is there a fiscal gap? So because of the increase in demand for public services generally driven by growth in population, caused by natural growth and migration, the natural tendency is that level of expenditures has also to be increased proportionately to the growth in population. However, because of the occurrence of calamity and the emerging development needs of the LGU, the financial resources of the LGUs coming from national transfers and internal sources may not be enough despite the implementation of revenue collection strategies. So the question now that we are raising, how do we close the fiscal gap? On the next slide, you will see local debt policy. This is considered as one of the 4 pillars of fiscal decentralization. Subnational debt policy and management has guidelines that need to be met. And what are these guidelines? First, it should build the capacity of local governments to borrow money to cover their expenditure responsibilities alongside their devolved functions. Debt management also must prioritize financing capital expenditure, and tax flows and political accountability must be fostered out of these decisions. So it is also vital that the national government plays an active role when it comes to local debt policy. On what areas? First, the prevention of a systemic LGU debt crisis that could force the national government to bail out heavily indented LGUs. Second one, strengthening the implementation of the statutory limit in LGU debts. And the third one, the promotion of responsible and credible debt management among the local government units. If we have this under the framework of local debt policy, then you will see on the next slide the legal framework of borrowings. The LGC and the implementing rules and regulation made it possible for LGUs to create indebtedness and avail of credit facilities for local structures and socio-economic development programs with government or private banks and lending institutions. The code also states that debt servicing must not exceed 20% of the LGU's annual regular income. Let me emphasize that. Under our existing parameter under the LGC, we don't limit how much the LGUs are borrowing. But what we are limiting is the debt servicing of the LGU. To ensure that this limit would not be breached and the LGUs would maximize the potential of their credit line, the Department of Finance is mandated to render technical assistance to any LGU in the availment of credit facilities. The Bureau of Local Government Finance, created by virtue of EO 127, is mandated to develop and promote plans and programs for the improvement of resource management systems, collection enforcement mechanism, and credit utilization schemes at the local levels. So what are the different forms of local indebtedness? Let's enumerate that and let's see the next slide for it. So let me give you the different forms of local indebtedness of an LGU. And these are the following: loans, credits, and other forms of indebtedness, deferred payment and other financial schemes, bonds and other long-term securities, interlocal government loans, grants, and other subsidies, and also loans from funds which are secured by the national government from foreign sources. Among the forms of local indebtedness, availing of credit lines through loans is the most frequently utilized by the LGUs. The LGC limits the purpose of local indebtedness. So these purposes or projects all point to a unifying goal. And what is this unifying goal? To assure LGUs economic growth and make them less era dependent. So how about the process? How do they avail of borrowings from lending institutions? So we have an LGU loan application process, which is a schematic diagram on the next slide. So on the next slide, you will see that the LGU loan application process and procedures involves 4 key institutions, and who are these 4 ones? The local government unit, of course, the one who will be borrowing. We also have the lending institution, the lender, the BLGF, and the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Let me concentrate on the shaded parts that we have in this slide. So the shaded part is the process that BLGF is requiring from the LGUs every time they secure from us the certificate of net debt service ceiling and borrowing capacity. So this certificate is among the what we call the ex ante fiscal control and regulations, which has been set in place to monitor the borrowings of an LGU. So if we have the process, of course, we'll have to give the guidelines on the documentary requirements. And what are these documentary requirements? On the next slide, you will see there are only 4. At present, BLGF requires 4 main documentary requirements from borrowing LGUs. Back in 2012, the number of required requirements was 12. So it has to be streamlined. So nahihirapan ang mga LGs to comply with the 12 documentary requirements. So we have to drop this 12 and concentrate on the most important documents that must be submitted to the BLGF. This also made the overall process of certification much faster. So the borrowing LGs submit these requirements to the BLGF offices in their respective region. If you're at the national capital region, then you will submit it directly to the BLGF central office. The regional offices then transmit these documents to us at the central office after a series of evaluations and upon making sure that we have a complete documentary requirements at hand, then the BLGF issues the certificate. Let's look at the certificate on the next slide. And what are the features of the BLGF certificate? So the certificate involves computation of 3 main figures. So you have to understand that there are 3 numbers that we have to compute for the certification. First is what we call the debt service ceiling. So the debt service ceiling is the maximum amount that an LGU can appropriate in the annual budget for the payment of its loan, statutory, and contractual obligations. This is equal to 20% of their annual regular income, which I mentioned earlier is one of the ex ante fiscal control that we have. The average previous 3-year locally sourced income is being computed, and of course, the shares from national taxes based on data. So this comprised the annual regular income of the LGU. So that's the first number that we have to crunch to be able to give the LGU the certificate. The second one is what we call the net debt service ceiling. So what makes it different from the first number, the debt service ceiling? If the LGU already has an existing loan, so we have to deduct those amortizations. But if you do not have any existing loan, that means your debt service ceiling now equals the net debt service ceiling. All of this together, and what will now be the third one, which is an important number that we have to produce, that is what we call the borrowing capacity. This is the maximum amount of statutory and contractual obligations that an LGU may incur over a period of 1 or more years at the specified rate of interest. So the tenor and the interest rates are involved in the computation. So we have to get those information. How many years will the LGU pay? What will be the interest rate? Because it will be a factor for us to compute the annuity factor. This is achieved by applying the LGU's net debt service ceiling to the annuity factor. So if you'll see on this slide, the certificate has three parts also. The letter to the local chief executive, the certificate, and directives to the local treasurer. So the release of certificate is controlled and monitored. So once a certificate is approved and released, an original copy is issued for the LGU, for the lending institution, and for the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, the three other main actors in the process of the certification. So before we end our presentation, let me give you some key takeaway message when it comes to LGU borrowings. First, it is beneficial for local government units in good financial standing. If they have good repayment record, if they are already a borrower, and they have projects well planned in their investment plans, and the window being offered has a low interest rate and reasonable tenor. What will be the second key takeaway message from the BLGF on LGU borrowings? Borrowing is not ideal for LGUs with budgetary deficit. If the LGUs have records of past due and default, if the LGU have questionable projects or projects not clearly identified in their investment plans, and the window being offered has a high interest rate and the tenor exceeds the economic useful life of the project being proposed. On the summary, what we have presented so far are the sources of revenues of the LGUs. We have the internal revenue source, which is generated from the taxing powers of the LGUs. We have the external source. These are the transfers coming from the national government. If these funding sources are not enough, and then the LG can now resort into borrowing or credit financing. It's subject to the debt policy management and rules. Thank you, everyone. That's it for the Bureau of Local Government Finance, Department of Finance.